because enslavement wasn't just physically abusive, it was also psychologically abusive. And as a form of psychological abuse, it was reliant on the alienation of African people from their homeland, but also from their languages and their families and their communities and their traditions.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past. I'm your host, Fie de Wit. In this episode, we journey into the paradoxical chapter of Statia's history. We find ourselves in the time period between 1700 to 1750, a moment when the island's history began to gain fame as a bustling center of commerce and trade, celebrated by colonial narratives as a symbol of progress and prosperity. But history is never one-sided, and beneath this glorified portrayal lies a distressing reality of enslavement and the continued suffering of those who endured it. While Statia's harbors was filled with ships and goods, and its streets bustled with trade, its prosperity was built on the backs of enslaved individuals, whose lives were defined by unimaginable hardship. This period also illuminates the profound resilience of women, both enslaved and free, whose stories of survival and empowerment challenges the colonial narrative. From women who inherited property and wielded influence in unconventional ways, to those who preserved cultural traditions, defied oppression, and led acts of resistance. Their legacy is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is strength and hope. As we delve into this era, we'll uncover Statia's rapid growth, its role in the chaotic web of European conflicts, and the layered experience of those who lived here. Together, we'll explore the complexities of history often celebrated for its colonial triumphs, while exposing the human costs that these narratives so often overlook. Historian and teacher Dr. Allain provides us with the insight into how plantation economies and their accompanying structures began to solidify, setting the stage for both its island's booming trade and the systematic exploitation that underpinned it.
Well, 1700 to 1750 is when we start to see these plantation economies really take off and there's a big boom, right? And then in the latter decades of the 18th century, we have these very mature plantation societies with a very distinct kind of culture. And the first, 5 decades of the 18th century is not a period that I think much has been written about with regard to gender specifically. So I would say this is a pivotal period in which these plantation economies are growing and, a sort of plantation society is emerging, but it's not quite fully formed yet.
As Dr. Allain highlights, the first decades of the 18th century was a critical time in the establishment of plantation economies. While the system was expanding, its cultural and gender dynamics were still taking shape, setting the stage for the entrenched inequalities and systematic exploitation that would follow. While the plantation systems expanded, Statia's role as a strategic trading hub was growing in equal measure. We now turn to Mrs. Soutekouw, long-term resident of Statia's and one of the founders of the Island Center of Archaeological Research. She explains that this period saw the island's development shaped not only by trade, but also by the ripple effects of European wars and the diversity of its residents, fostering a complex and ever-changing landscape.
Well, you have to remember that when there were wars in Europe, just Europe wasn't affected. Often the Caribbean was affected too. So if the Dutch were at war with France or England, those people were often coming here to try to capture this island. So Stacia changed hands many times, and that period of time was especially active. Also during that time, Stacia began to grow. We began to add more warehouses. As Stacia grew, more people came to the island. People here on Stacia were a mix of people from many different nationalities because we were a trading island. Unlike the English islands around it, where you would find mostly only English people, here you had people from all over. Stacia was part of the Dutch West Indian trading But the Dutch East Indian Trading Company had been in existence for many years. Even people as far away as Asia were actually living here. So Stacia was growing, and we were building more and more warehouses. We were also at that same time establishing ourselves as a trading nation among the Caribbean islands. So it was a busy time.
During the first half of the 18th century, Sint-Eustatius found itself at the center of a growing trading network, shaped as much by the European wars as by local commerce. As Mrs. Soutekouw explains, the island's strategic location and growing infrastructure drew people from across the globe, creating a unique, diverse population, but also making it a target during times of conflict. Sint-Eustatius' diverse population mirrored its growing trade networks with records revealing the breadth of its connection to other European and Caribbean colonies. As Mrs. Soutekouw shares, tax records provide glimpses of the island's bustling economy, but leaves much unsaid about the lives of the people, especially the enslaved individuals who lived and labored here.
If you look at the records and you look at the names of the people on the record, the tax records, which are the best records we have, you'll notice a lot of English, French, Dutch, possibly German names, other people's names. We were trading with the Danish colonies. We were trading with Swedish colonies. So those people may very well have been here. So looking at the records of the tax records tells you something about the owners of properties that are here, but it doesn't tell you about the whole population.
Sint-Eustatius' tax records reveals a kaleidoscope of culture and national identities evident of the island's vibrant trading community. As Mrs. Soutekouw notes, these records hint at the complexity of life on Sint-Eustatius, where property ownerships tells us only part of the story, leaving the lives of many, particularly the enslaved, in the shadows. Yet, within this fragmented history, we find hints of women's significant roles, both as inheritors of property and as key figures navigating societal constraints.
The only things that we know are from the records that we have of death records and records of birth and stuff like that. And so we don't have a lot of information, but we're beginning to compile some. In many cases, the men were dying young and their widows were inheriting property, which would then go to whoever they remarried later on. But most often the property was actually passing through the women, not through the men.
The Fragmented Records offers glimpses into women's agency during this time, whether through inheriting property or participating in localized economies. Women, both European and free women of color, played crucial roles in Statia's social and economic fabric. This echoes earlier traditions seen in Amerindian societies, where land and influence often passed through female lines, illustrating how women's resilience persisted across cultures and eras. Simultaneously, this era on Sint-Eustatius saw a marked increase in the transatlantic and inter-island trade of enslaved individuals. As Mrs. Soutekouw explains, the island's role as both a direct importer of enslaved people from Africa and a hub for smaller kleinbark trade placed it at the heart of a system of human exploitation.
A lot of slaves coming through Stacia. But the number of slaves in Stacia itself that were actually living here, that grew much later than that period of time. And I don't know a whole lot about it because, again, we haven't had the research that we should have had done here. There may be research done, but a lot of those records are just now being digitized and we're beginning to get hold of them. Stacia was a major slave trading island. There were two types of slave trade that were going on here. The ones where the people were actually being brought from Africa, then sold from here to other places, to the United States, to other islands, around the Caribbean. Then there was what was called the Kleinvaart, the small island trade, where slaves were being traded. Say you had slaves that you wanted to sell or buy. You would bring them or come to Stacia to buy them. So the small island trade between the island was being done on Stacia, even if it was with the France and the French islands or the Dane, who were also slave traders. They were actually bringing slaves in from Africa also, or the Swedish or the English or other islands. So there was two different, although they were all the same in that they were all putting people into bondage.
Statia's role in the transatlantic enslaved trade was multifaceted. The Kleinvaart trade, also known as small island trade, functioned as a regional market for enslaved individuals who had been transported from Africa or neighboring colonies. Enslaved individuals were brought to Stacia not only to be sold directly to buyers from across the Caribbean, but also to facilitate exchanges between islands, including those under French, Danish, Swedish, and British control. This practice often meant breaking apart families and communities, adding another layer of cruelty to an already dehumanizing system. Despite these horrors, Stacia also saw acts of defiance and resistance. These stories remind us that even in systems designed to erase agency, individuals found ways to assert their humanity. As we delve deeper, the dual roles of commerce and exploitation on this island become impossible to separate. Statia's strategic location and natural harbor not only facilitate its role as a major trading hub, but also sets the stage for its participation in the transatlantic enslaved trade. In episode 1, we touched upon the natural landscape of Stacia as a key factor in its historical significance. And again, we turn to Dr. Ruud Stelton, an archaeologist with first-hand experience working here on Stacia. He will elaborate further on this topic. His insight will help us understand why Stacia's Bay was so influential, shaping its rise as a bustling center of trade and a pivotal player in the economic and social systems of the Caribbean.
What's perhaps most interesting from a historical point of view is the area to the west of town, basically Oranje Bay. And especially the area basically going from Lower Town out for about 2.5, 3 miles. That area is a very shallow, sandy, submerged area landscape. On the leeward side of the island, that's very important. So on the relatively sheltered side of the island. And that area was used back in the 16 and 1700s for ships to anchor, right? So one of the problems that you have, as even though, like on Stacia, right, the social and economic conditions were very conducive to turn this into a free port and to receive lots and lots of trade and to become a big emporium, the landscape also needs to cooperate, not just terrestrial, but also marine. And it did so on Stacia because in order to house that many ships at a time, you need a large bay. You need either a large enclosed harbor or a large bay of some sort, or what they call a roadstead back in the day, right? That's the area where all these ships were dropping anchor. And that roadstead needs to be pretty sandy as well, because those anchors, they need to hold, right? Anchor, if a ship drops an anchor, it needs to bury itself in the sand. You need a sandy seafloor for that. It cannot be covered in coral reefs and rocks and things like that. The very good thing about Stacia is that it had just that. It had a large sandy area right in front of Lower Town, on the leeward side of the island. That doesn't mean that it's always nice and calm there, because if you're doing a nice sunset cruise close to the waterfront, in Lower Town, you'll be all right, usually. But if you go 1.5, 2 kilometers out, it can get pretty rough because the island is not perfectly oriented north-south, but also it is not very big. So it doesn't provide a whole lot of shelter. It provides some, but not a whole lot. So the further out you go, the rougher it gets. So I'm sure like a lot of people on these ships, that were there sometimes for a few days, but sometimes for weeks or even months on end, like they were not having a good time. If you're anchored further out and it's choppy and it's constantly rough, like you're not going to have a good time. But you could still anchor there. And so that's important, right? So in the Caribbean, we have a few very specific ports, basically. If you look at St. Bart's in the town of Gustavia, you have a very nice enclosed area that is the harbor, right? So over there, yes, you can sail a number of ships in, but it's not that many, not as many as you would have on Stacia. But you would be in a very nice, calm, controlled area. But on Stacia, it was all about volume. And so there's eyewitness accounts from the late 1700s. For example, Admiral Rodney, but also Dutch sailors who mentioned that there were at any time between 150 and 200 ships anchored in Stacia's roadstead. That's a crazy number of ships.
As Dr. Stelton illustrates, the natural features of St. Eustatius provides the perfect condition for a bustling maritime trade. The sandy seabed and the sheltered roadstead offered a haven for hundreds of ships to arrive each year, making Stacia a vital point of connection in the Caribbean economic web. But this trade was not only for goods, it was also about enslaved people, whose lives were commodified and uprooted. With this context, we turn to the island's heritage inspector, Mr. Richardson, who paints a vivid picture of life on the island during the early 18th century.
So it's 1720. First of all, around 1720, I must say, in the spatial development plan, you see that the city Oranien's, it's blooming. They develop a spatial development plan of 1720, which kind of gives street names to new places, buildings. The population is extremely high. I think it's past 8,000 at that period of time. There's lots of people living on the island, lots. So much that people that are visiting St. Eustatius are referring to the island back then as one of the ugliest islands in the Caribbean. And that's because the minute you set foot on the horizon, one description from a French gentleman and his family and his wife then that are touring the Caribbean describes the island as a floating European city, that the houses are stories high and you can hardly see any green, that it's overcultivated, it's overpopulated, and there's commerce of everything and every sort happening on the island. And then later on, you see other letters from a lady of quality called Janet Shaw, for example, who also writes about the island's unattractive appearance and also quite smelly, but also quite noisy. And then there's also another British gentleman who also refers to that he has never seen the extent of such debauchery and trade on St. Eustatius. He hasn't seen it anywhere else. So you already get an idea of what the island is like. So it kind of visualizes the noise, the sound, the street, and of course the trading. There's a lot of trading going on. The island is blooming. It's way before this American independence will be coming later on. But the island is really trading and blooming. And it's also trading, of course, in people, in porcelain, in opium. Everything that is possible is being traded. But what's also interesting is the amount of plantations. The amount of plantations around then are about 30. This would eventually skyrocket when, of course, the British come in and plunder the island, etc. It will eventually go up to higher numbers. But then when you look at the demographics of the island's population of free and colored, you also see, for example, free people of color, 1,200. What are they doing? Who are they? But you also see on the list Chinese immigrants, 2 Japanese immigrants living on St. Eustatius. What are all these people doing here? What's also interesting is that when you look at the enslaved people, for example, many of them are working in the custom houses. Many of them are working in the warehouses. Of course, not under the best of circumstances, of course, because if you look at the letters that are being wrote about the island and the stench that you can also get out of these letters, you know that the work on floor isn't the best place. The island is really blooming, it's expanding, and it's growing. And in all of this time, like I said in the beginning, from 1636 to where we are now in the 1720s, the island is still changing hands already. So in that period, it's already been British, it's already been French, it's already been Dutch, and it's going back and forth. It's very chaotic.
Mr. Richardson's account reveals the paradox of the 18th century Stacia, a place bustling with life and commerce, yet burdened by the grim realities of enslavement and exploitation. From the chatter of people to the noise of bustling warehouses, the streets of Oranjestad hummed with activities, but amidst the activity, the human cost of progress loomed large. Enslaved individuals labored in custom houses and warehouses, enduring unimaginable conditions. Despite this, stories of resilience and defiance began to emerge, offering glimpses of humanity within the chaos.
And one of the interesting things is that, of course, all of the abolitionists, people are starting to speak out about the slave trade also, but no one ever will abolish slavery on St. Eustatius until 1816. So let's keep that in mind as we go through these episodes. You will see that it's going to be a long period where the French capture St. Eustatius, the island becomes French, and the French continue the trade where the Dutch left off, and the Brit. So it was just the fast money. And that also reflected how people of color were being treated. But in that period, there's also some, very interesting stories of people defying the odds. And I will, of course, as we go on, expand on these very interesting stories.
By 1720, Oranjestad was a hive of activity, its economy thriving amidst the constant movement of goods, people, and ideas. Mr. Richardson vividly illustrates this boom from bustling warehouses to sprawling plantations that defined life here on the island. Yet, beneath the veneer of prosperity lay the stark realities of human exploitation. These untold stories of resilience and defiance challenges the colonial narratives of unbridled progress. They remind us that St. Eustatius' flourishing trade and wealth was built on the labor and endurance of those who lived through unimaginable hardship, leaving traces of their humanity in the shadows of history. While the bustling streets of Oranjestad and the booming trade painted a picture of growth and prosperity, the experience of women under enslavement continued to reveal a harrowing and often overlooked reality. As we keep taking a closer look of the profound difference between the lives of men and women, we see the unique burden women bore within the systems of slavery, one that extends far beyond forced labor. Their roles as mothers and their ability to bear children place them at the very core of a system's perpetuation, subjecting them to a cruel and calculated exploitation of humanity. Historian Dr. Anishanslin helps us explore further this profoundly gendered dimension of enslavement.
I think women's experience under enslavement was always fundamentally different from men's, and that is irrespective of place and time. And that's partly because in this system of transatlantic African chattel slavery that rose up in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the Caribbean in particular, as one of the central focus points of where millions of people were sent and lived, women were the ones able to naturally reproduce more enslaved people. And so their bodies were seen as property, but also as property that had the potential to create more property for their enslavers. And this, of course, puts women in a terrible dilemma of knowing that any children they have, if they themselves are enslaved, will be legally born enslaved as well. And so this makes them obviously the focus of, in some cases, deliberate rapes by enslavers who want them to reproduce. And this doesn't just happen in the Caribbean. We have a documented instance of it happening in 1630s Massachusetts. So, this is not something that's limited to the Caribbean. But I think women did have this potential within the eyes of enslavers. And then, of course, they themselves as human beings and as mothers, this puts them often in the terrible predicament of what would normally be one of the great joys of most women's lives, which is having children, knowing that they're bringing children into this horrible system. I think would have been an extra burden that women had to bear that men did not in the same way, because if men were raped within the system of slavery, it was not to impregnate them, which is often what happened to women. And women, of course, were able to also have unique forms of resistance apart from men, in the sense that, sometimes these sexual relations were not entirely coercive. And we do have, examples here and there of couples who were intimate where there seems to have been real affection, although, of course, it's always hard to say if a woman is enslaved, how much she is able to exercise free will in that respect. But so you do have instances of families being created. Some enslaved women are able to parlay that into freedom for themselves or freedom for their children eventually. And so I think that is something that is a road that's more commonly available for enslaved women than men, although, of course, these are, a tiny, tiny fraction of the experience of enslaved people in the Caribbean. But it's still there, nevertheless.
Dr. Anishanslin offers a profound exploration of a deeply gendered experience of enslavement, highlighting the unique burden bore by women. Their ability to bear children, cruelly reframed through the lens of colonial exploitation, turned them into both laborers and commodities. Yet, amidst such dehumanization, women displayed remarkable resilience and found ways to reclaim agency, leaving behind legacies of strength that defy the colonial narrative. This narrative of resilience is further reflected in the story of Statia's mysterious blue bead. These small objects that we have spoken about in previous episodes were initially used as currency, evolved into powerful symbols of resistance, identity, and cultural preservation. To help us understand their profound significance and their impact on the lives of the enslaved here on Statia's, we now turn to archaeologist Dr. Zahedi.
The blue bead economy was not a static system. The value of the beads was most likely determined by the person who owned the bead. It wasn't like the type of official currency that other people were using. And so they might have used the beads for many different things. I mean, of course, we know the story about a man needing to have enough beads to go around a woman's waist to marry her, which would be a form of dowry. People might have also used beads for certain provisions, if they weren't producing enough in their gardens, for different skills, all sorts of things. Because within the wider economy of the island, enslaved villages and enslaved communities had their own communities, their own economies, where they were producing their own goods. So it was kind of like a smaller economy within the larger economy, if that makes sense.
Blue beads, while primarily associated with the enslaved population as a form of currency for labor, may have also had a broader role on the island. Questions linger about whether these beads also facilitated exchanges between free individuals and the enslaved, hinting at a more intricate web of economic and social relationships here on Statia's. Unfortunately, much remains unknown about these interactions. The use of blue beads in this context is still a mystery, and further research, particularly into free villages and their historical records, could provide crucial insights. But for now, this gap in our understanding highlights the ongoing effort required to fully uncover the complexity of life here on Stacia during that time. To delve deeper into the connection between blue beads and women, Dr. Zahedi continues to explore how these seemingly simple objects carried profound significance. Rooted in West African traditions, the beads symbolize fertility, femininity, and identity, elements that enslaved women brought with them to Statia's. But how did these beads shape their lives? Were they merely relics of cultural memory, or did they transform into tools of resistance and empowerment within a system designed to deny their sovereignty? These questions guide us as we unravel the layered history of blue beads and their enduring impacts of the lives of enslaved women on the island.
There's a prevalent story on Stacia that for an enslaved man to marry a woman, he had to have enough beads to wrap all the way around her waist. And that tradition of wearing beads around the waist or the hips comes from West Africa. It's an ancient adornment practice. That practice was brought to the Caribbean and the Americas, and the most famous example of that is from a grave in the African burial ground in New York City, where African women were buried with their waist beads. So the waist beads symbolize fertility, sensuality, femininity, and that practice being brought to Stacia is, I would say, in itself, a symbol of resistance and self-empowerment. Because enslavement wasn't just physically abusive, it was also psychologically abusive. And as a form of psychological abuse, it was reliant on the alienation of African people from their homeland, but also from their languages and their families and their communities and their traditions. And that cultural genocide was a way of controlling people that was often more effective in meeting colonial objectives than physical violence. So even though we think about something like waist beads as maybe even a kind of fashion from a contemporary perspective, the truth is that these ancestral feminine practices that were brought to the Caribbean are anti-colonial through the preservation of tangible and intangible heritage traditions. So when we look at the colonial order, which depended on keeping enslaved people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, which is why the Dutch gave blue beads to enslaved people instead of money, they didn't want them to participate in the wider economy. They didn't want them to benefit from the prosperity experienced by members of the elite. But enslaved people resisted that too. They created their own economies. For women to then play a role in how the blue beads as a form of currency were valued is also a form of resistance, not only against colonialism, but also as a way of exerting feminine power over a patriarchal system. So a woman who is well-fed with a curvaceous body can then have the self-agency to determine her own value. She can say, you don't have enough beads to go around my waist, so go get more and then maybe I'll marry you if you're lucky. And that's empowering, I think, on a different level. We can also look at the way that beads are worn in the contemporary period. So a lot of women on Stacia now have established new meaning with the beads. They're not a symbol of oppression. They're a symbol of cultural preservation and ancestral connection. So people wear beads in their hair. They wear beads as necklaces or as bracelets. And that's also a way of entangling the past with the present and bringing those stories to life and honoring women of the past.
As we conclude this episode, we reflect on the paradoxical history of St. Eustatius between 1700 and 1750, a period defined by immense growth, bustling trade, and cultural exchange, yet underpinned by the harrowing realities of enslavement and systematic exploitation. Amid the noise of Oranjestad's streets and the sails of countless ships in the harbor, stories of resilience and defiance are starting to emerge, offering glimpses of humanity within the chaotic and often brutal world. We've explored how St. Eustatius' natural harbor made it a vital hub of global commerce, with its plantations and warehouses fueling an economy built on the backs of enslaved individuals. At the heart of this history are the women whose strength and resilience challenges the colonial narrative. Enslaved women, burdened by the dual exploitation of labor and forced reproduction, resisted through acts of cultural preservation and empowerment. Free women, both white and of color, navigating societal constraint, asserting influence in unconventional ways, inheriting properties, and shaping Stacia's social fabric. These stories remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, women's courage and agency served as a quiet yet powerful act of defiance. But Stacia's story is far from over, and in our next episode, we'll step into the latter half of the 18th century, a time when the island earned its name, the Golden Rock. This era of extraordinary wealth and influence brought new opportunities, heightened tension, and profound challenges both with the island and on a global stage. Join us as we continue to uncover the rise of Stacia's golden age and the complex legacy it left behind. Until then, let us continue to carry the lessons of history with reverence. And we leave you to ponder on these questions. How do we reckon with a prosperity built on human suffering? How do we honor the resilience of those whose stories remain in the margins of history? And most importantly, how do these reflections challenge us to critically engage with the legacy of colonial power that is still being celebrated today? As we confront these questions, let us recognize that understanding the past is not merely an act of remembrance, but a call to confront injustice, to challenge inherited narratives, and most importantly, a catalyst for meaningful change.